So, written out some learning objectives today. So by the end of today, you should be able to define what life cycle assessment is and describe its applications. You'll also be able to describe the 4 stages of life cycle assessment. So this is a kind of a nuts and bolts of how do you do a life cycle assessment. Actually, I have this here too. Whoa, what did I do, her? Okay. I put them up here because I'm going to cross them out as we go. So describe the 4 stages of LCA. Choose a functional unit. I'll hopefully know what a functional unit is. And you'll be able to describe the advantages and disadvantages of an LCA. So now if you notice the verbs here, you're seeing describe a lot, define. So anybody ever hear of Bloom's taxonomy of learning? These are pretty low-level learning objectives. Higher-level learning objectives would be analyze, pair, apply. So basically, after today, when you go to the Christmas party, you should be able to talk with people about LCA. And to really learn, and you have to start doing it. And once you start doing it, you'll have questions. And I didn't put my email up here, but you can find me on the IPSC website. Okay, I'll actually write it here. Someone reminds me. So that's the first part. So it's basically intro to LCA. Hopefully not for dummies. And the second part, I'm going to talk about a recent study that I did with my colleague Leda Gerber on applying LCA to look at target parameters for a new renewable technology. And actually, in the first slide here, most of the introductory slides are Leda, so I want to thank her right off the bat. All right, so to start, I just want to wake you guys up after lunch. So I guess you can pass these papers around and maybe do this in 2s or 3s. So 1 piece of paper for 2 or 3 person. So I'm from Ithaca, New York, and Ithaca is on the shores of Lake Cayuga. Cayuga Lake is about 1/3 to half the size of Lake Geneva, and in the United States, this is a pretty small lake. And on the northeast end, we have this 400 megawatt coal-fired power plant that's having some financial trouble right now because we have really cheap natural gas in the US. And so there's talk to retrofit the plant and go from using coal as the resource to natural gas. So I want you with a partner, or you can do 3 if it's easier, to just quickly, I'm going to give you 30 seconds. We'll see how that goes. List all the things you would want to consider, as many as you can, if you were deciding whether you want to have this plant run on coal or natural gas. Okay? Anybody have questions before I start my timer? And don't think about it too much. Just like throw out, we'll see who can get the most items. All right, 30 seconds. Go. All right, 5 more seconds. Just write down as many things as you can. All right. So this group, what was something?
We have 5 things.
Yeah.
Future costs, yes.
Yeah.
Emissions, lifetime, energy efficiency, and energy efficiency means is it like cogeneration?
Okay, good. And what about you in the back? Do you have anything extra to add? Something else you guys thought about that they didn't already say? Oh, I'm sorry. So the question was, if you're deciding what you want to power this 400 megawatt power plant with, if you have to choose between coal and natural gas, what types of things would you consider? All right, so what about over here?
Additions for the mining.
Cool. The what costs? Operating costs. Good. You guys, anything to add that wasn't said? I know a lot was said already. Are you ladies?
Natural gas could be produced chemically.
Marketta, your team, anything extra?
Transportation of the fuel, we should create price of the fuel, all like the legal things around
Good.
and waste stream.
Waste streams. Good. All right. So the way I would categorize all the things you said, and maybe some others too, but I think you guys covered most things. There'd be technical issues, right? We want to think about plant efficiency, reliability. There'd be economic issues. I think everyone mentioned economic issues, environmental issues, and that's where life cycle assessment focuses, and perhaps social issues, employment. For this case, food security and is not going to be an issue, but you could imagine with biofuels, which I'm going to talk a lot about today. Ligan, I didn't ask you, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, maybe.
All right. So with life cycle assessment that I'm going to talk about today, we're really going to focus on environmental issues. Also in the case study, I talk about our study in algae. I'm going to talk about environmental and economic issues. And I will say that a new area of interest is using life cycle assessment to look at social issues. I've never done that, and I'm not going to talk about that today, although it's interesting. All right, so what is life cycle assessment? It's a systematic methodology by which you can quantify and analyze the environmental impacts of a product, a process, or even a service. I read a study recently about doing life cycle assessment on a radio show. All right, so I can cross off the first learning objective, or half of it. We defined LCA. So the goal with life cycle assessment is identify ways to improve a process or a product without shifting the burden. So by what I mean by shifting the burden is I don't, let's say I say, oh, corn ethanol. Corn ethanol is the best thing ever. It's going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I'm not saying that's true, by the way, but let's just assume it is. And so then I decide, oh, I'm going to replace my fossil gasoline or petrol with corn ethanol. But the corn ethanol in the Midwestern United States requires a lot of pesticides and fertilizer, and this winds up polluting the Chesapeake Bay, which is a very sensitive watershed, so then I shift the burden from the greenhouse gas emissions to nutrient pollution. And we don't want to do that. So we want to improve without shifting the burden. So this is a study that was done in 2007 within the Swiss context, looking at different biofuels and comparing them to petrol. And so there's different fuels. We have here biodiesel, ethanol, methane. And we're comparing them to these fossil fuels. And on the y-axis here, we have global warming potential in units of CO2 equivalents. So here, and this is an example of what LCA can be used for, it's really good for comparing processes. So I can decide whether I think ethanol from wood is better than low sulfur diesel, for example. In this case, with respect to greenhouse gas emissions. It also allows me to identify bottlenecks or hotspots, or where in my process do I want to focus my research on improving. So for example, here, you can see the greenhouse gas emissions divided up by unit process. So we have, and we'll talk about unit processes more soon, but to make fuel from biomass, we have the cultivation. Then we have what they're calling here the production. I would call that the conversion process, converting the biomass to the energy source, transportation, both of the fuel and of the feedstock, and combustion. So if I look here on ethanol from potatoes, I want to focus my improvements on the cultivation, right? That's where I'm getting most of my emissions from. So these two items LCA is quite good for identifying which part of your process or product production or use, which part of the life cycle you want to address, to improve, and to compare. And actually, one thing, I'm going to go back to this slide. I forgot, I defined what life cycle assessment is, but I didn't detail what do I mean by life cycle. Because it's right here, it says over the entire life cycle. So what do I mean by life cycle? Well, just like we have a life cycle, right? You're born, go to school, maybe you get married, maybe you don't, you have kids, grandkids, and then you die. So just like that, products and processes also have a life cycle. A little different. Humans, usually we talk about extraction of resources, manufacturing or production, use. Here, this is from a TED Talk. It's really actually quite good. You should Google her. She also breaks it up into transport. But usually we talk about extraction, manufacturing, use, and disposal. The four main stages of the life cycle. All right, so in addition, so we don't do burden shifting. Life cycle assessment allows us to look at different kinds of impacts. So before I showed you a graph with global warming potential here, same author Za compares these different biofuels based on other impacts. So we have acidification, eutrophication, toxicity, and land use. I know somebody mentioned land use with the coal versus gas. So it allows us to look at multiple environmental impacts. Although, at least in the US, Europe people are better about it. In the US, it's mostly applied to greenhouse gas emissions. But, all right, so we're really done with the first one. Okay, so now we're going to describe the four stages, and actually a lot of today we're going to spend on this. See, I got to watch the time, so. All right, so these are the four stages of life cycle assessment. Goal and scope definition. We're going to detail each one. Inventory analysis. So the inventory analysis is actually where the guts of the labor, of your labor as an LCA practitioner is. Impact assessment and interpretation of your results. Now what I want to point out in this graph are the back and forth arrows. This winds up being a very iterative process. So you might define the scope of your life cycle assessment, which includes defining a functional unit. I'm going to talk about very next slide or two slides. And then you do your inventory analysis, and this is where you catalog all of your material inputs and outputs, and you might realize that you don't have enough data, or you don't have the right kind of data to actually achieve the goal and scope that you outlined, so you might have to change it. So yeah, I had a student, a master's student, and at Bucknell, you have to write a proposal. She wrote this proposal, and she wrote that in there, how LCA is iterative. And then when she's trying to finish her thesis, and I told her, wait, you have to go back and reanalyze this a different way. She got very upset and like, you're changing the scope of my project. And then I pulled that quote out from her proposal, and I said, it's just how it goes. So it's a pain, but if you want to do the study correctly, it's sad, especially when you're trying to graduate. She did graduate, a little late, but. All right, so now we're going to go through these four stages. So that first stage, the goal and scope, the first thing you want to determine is what's the purpose of your LCA, who's your audience, what systems are you studying. This is really just the whole list. You can have this for later. And what are the underlying assumptions and limitations? And clearly, limitations, this is probably something you're going to better define towards the end of your study. So again, back to this being iterative. So one of the important assumptions and one of the critical parts of doing an LCA is choosing the right functional unit. And a functional unit, or FU, which makes it really easy to remember, especially if you're pissed off or something, is the unit to which you bring back all of the other quantities in your study. And if that's not clear, it should be soon. On another slide, so just hold on if it's not clear. But actually, in general, please stop me if you have questions. The system boundaries, here's where you decide which stages of the life cycle are you going to include in your study. So I once read this part of a book about life cycle assessment, and he described it as this multi-limbed Indian god or something, because if you think about it, if you want to do the whole life cycle, and let's say you're trying to do an assessment of electricity, you might include the steel that was produced to make your electricity plant. And then you might go back and include the electricity that was produced to make the steel. And you can see you could go back. So at some point you have to decide where you're going to cut it off, right? So it's not some crazy Indian god going on forever. I didn't really quite understand the analogy, but I should probably go back and read it. And you also decide which scenarios you're going to compare. So in the ZA data I showed you, they were comparing multiple feedstocks. I don't know if you probably couldn't see, but there's manure and there's potatoes and there's corn and multiple types of fuels. They looked at methane, natural gas, ethanol, diesel. So here when you do your goal and scope, you decide which scenarios you're going to include. All right, so let's continue with this biofuels. It's something I'm familiar with. So in the case of the ZA study, the purpose of the study was for policy development. So Swiss government wanted to look at different types of biofuels and whether they had environmental advantages. So the audience was policymakers. The function was to provide transportation services. So I didn't mention this before, but all those impacts in the graphs I showed you were per 1 kilometer traveled. That was the functional unit, so I should have asked you that. Oh well, I gave it away. Okay. I don't expect you to notice. All right, so before I said that a functional unit is the quantity to which all other quantities are brought back. So I just want to show you an example of this to make sure it's clear. I'm moving away from biofuels for a moment. Here, the functional unit is just a kilowatt hour of electricity provided to the user, as symbolized by this light bulb. And for 1 kilowatt hour, 1.02 kilowatt hour was transmitted. This was a specific electricity mix for a specific country. So 40% was hydro, 30% nuclear, etc. So per kilowatt hour of electricity at the user, 0.31 kilowatt hours of electricity was generated from nuclear. And then if we just take the nuclear back, then we have this, 8 times 10 to the minus 7 kilograms of uranium. So it's so every quantity in my inventory, and I haven't quite defined what inventory is, but every quantity that I'm including in my inventory, which is my list of all my inputs and outputs, is going to be scaled to the functional. Any questions about that? Oh yeah, what life cycle stage is this? Remember the 3 are, this is just their extraction, production, use, disposal. Yeah. And maybe some extraction, but it looks like I would say production stage. All right, so again, I'm staying away from the biofuels just for a moment. Let's imagine that we're building a new campus building in Sion, and we want to decide if in the bathrooms we should have paper towels or power dryers. So what's the functional unit? Yeah, I don't know the answer, which is better, but what would be the functional unit? Talk to your neighbor for 10 seconds, just 20 seconds. What do you think the functional unit is? I think I heard it. What did you all say?
1 pair of dry hands.
Exactly. You guys are very clever. Much better than my undergrads. Yeah, I think so. Good job. Impressed. All right. All right, back to the biofuels. So we're still in the goal and scope. So I already told you that Xi used 1 kilometer traveled as the functional unit. What other functional unit might you use for, let's say that they were all, I think, liquid or gas. Let's say they were all liquid biofuels. A liter of fuel, Why might not that work? If you remember, there was ethanol, there was diesel, there was. That's right, they have different heating values. So most commonly people use a megajoule. And where I've seen the kilometer traveled really be important is when people want to compare an electric car to a conventional combustion-based car. Okay, so what's being included here, we're going to say, are the cultivation of the biomasses. So in this model, assuming we have 2 biomasses, there were multiple in SAS data, but we have corn, maybe wood, we have the conversion process. Then during the use phase, we have storage of the fuel, right? Usage in the car, maintenance. Although this maintenance, really, it's not maintenance of the car, it's maintenance of this, but it is during the use phase. Dismantling of the plant, recycling and disposal. So this is pretty typical. Sometimes in energy production systems, people ignore the plant because it's minor, but it's not so hard to do with cases. Okay, so as far as the scenario, what Zod did was the comparison was to fossil fuels, so that was the reference. You'll see that in some data I show you. There were alternative feedstocks and alternative products. And because of alternative products, there were alternative production processes. But there could be a case where you have diesel and you have different production processes. So in our first paper on algae, we actually converted algae to diesel via 2 different processes. One was transesterification to biodiesel, and one was a hydrothermal process to a green crude. But again, this is something you decide when you're setting up your model. Do you want to do all these feedstocks and all the products, or do you want to stick to one product and one feedstock? And it really, again, it depends on your study, your audience, the whole purpose. So there's not really a rule for that. All right. Yeah, it's an awesome process. So how do we decide if it's an awesome process? Well, we're going to do an LCA. So since you were so good, at least one of you or a couple of you, I thought I heard it because you also saved your hands, but this one's a little harder, choosing the functional unit. So what functional unit are we going to use if we have one feedstock and multiple products? And what functional would you use if you have multiple products, multiple feedstocks? Wait, that's what I said. No, one feedstock, multiple products, and the other way around, multiple feedstocks, one product. So again, take like, I don't know, 15 seconds. All right, 30 seconds. It's okay if you don't think of it. So as an example, think of like corn and wood would be your feedstocks, and the products would be, let's say, diesel and ethanol. So imagine you have one feedstock like corn, and you're going to make ethanol and methane from it, or wood. Right, you guys got it? Is it clear about like what the question is? It's kind of confusing. You got it? Okay. All right. So what do you guys, I'm standing right here, I'll let you. Yep. Yep. Excellent. I don't need to be here today. We can all just go to a Christmas party. All right, does anyone have a question about that? Anyone want to ask me what do you do if you have multiple feedstocks and multiple products? Not sure. I mean, you might do it on a unit. You could do it on a unit of energy produced. You could do it on a unit of land used to cultivate the feedstock. I would probably try different functional units. What?
Euros of added value or money of
Money. Interesting. All right. I'm not being sarcastic. So, okay, we're in stage 2. Did we just get to? Yes, we're starting stage 2. Yes. Okay, so now we're doing the inventory. This is the really laborious part of LCA. So we want to quantify all of the substances that are emitted or depleted from the environment. So this is really the interaction between what an LCA called the technosphere and the environment. So for depleted, and this is also some LCA lingo, there's resources and they're categorized as land resources, biotic, abiotic, and air and water, depending on where they come from. And then emissions, we have air emissions. This is actually pretty more straightforward, I think, because you can imagine if something is emitted that's a particle matter, something that causes respiratory problems, it matters whether it's in a low population or a high population. If it's something like ozone, it matters where in the atmosphere it's emitted. Ozone is good up high and bad down low. Water, soil. Some examples for the resources are, the biggest one I deal with is primary energy, so crude oil, coal, natural gas, metals. For air, CO2, for water, phosphate, nitrate, big one, soil, pesticides. But there's thousands of substances, very comprehensive. So, yeah, so how do you collect all of these? Well, you want to do this for every stage in your process, every unit process. And luckily there are databases that can help you with this. So if you had to, well, for your conversion to fuel, if it's a new process, like Katie, you're working on some very novel new process, you're going to have to make your own inventory. But things for like making electricity, combusting natural gas, there's databases, which I'll give you a list in just a minute. But again, these are just the same type of items. These are items you're depleting from the environment, so it's a resource depletion impact, and these are pollutants. And we just want to basically list them all. So if we look at an example of rapeseed, biodiesel from rapeseed oil, a rapeseed plant, what you'll end up with, and this is per 1 kilometer traveled, is this big list. And here I'm only showing 4 items from this list. And this is your inventory. So your inventory are the items that are emitted or taken out of the environment into what we call the technosphere, into your processes. So the way I'm illustrating this is the items that are in your inventory are illustrated here by the red arrows. Now to calculate these, you also have to calculate the links between processes. And those are the flows between the processes. And we call those are in LCA lingo called flows within the technosphere. Right? Because I need to know, this is a megajoule of natural gas burn, so I need to know how much megajoule was extracted and then cleaned up. Right? The heavy hydrocarbons have to be removed before it's transported. And here is a database, my favorite database I use. So this comes out of the EcoInvent database, and you get from in your inventory, within the inventory from EcoInvent, there's again a list of the substances for a vector. So I listed 2 other databases. GREET, it's also American and US LCI. The disadvantages of these 2 databases is that they don't include any uncertainty in their values. It's all single values. But I have in my work, especially when the application is the US, and these are US specific, I've taken stuff from EcoInvent and compared it. And actually, if there's something weird, you see something strange, because if we have time, we'll talk about an email that went around in this group. But there are mistakes, and so it's not a bad idea to verify something, especially if it's on TV. All right, so we're on to 3, inventory. Or no, impact assessment. So we have our inventory results, right? So we have now this list of all these substances. So how are we going to transform these substances into environmental impacts? This is what we want to do. And This actually, for the practitioner, is not that hard. This is easy because there are existing impact assessment methods. I'll give you a list of some of them. And this is actually calculated for you on the EcoInvent database, or you can write code or get data from the impact assessment method that converts every single one of those substances into an impact. In some cases, it's called a characterization factor. The factor that converts, let's say, CO2 into global warming might be 0, but there's a characterization, right? Because NOx, let's say, or CO2 emissions doesn't have ecotoxicity. So not every substance has an impact. So at this stage, the impacts are converted into, the inventory is converted into impacts. And these type of impacts are called midpoint impacts. So there's many of them. This is from Eco-Indicator. So things like eutrophication, human toxicity, acidification, and then some of the impact assessment methods will then collate these into what are called endpoint categories. And these are looked at more from the damage perspective in LCA lingo. I like looking at endpoint characteristics because it's more synthetic. When you're reporting something in a paper, it's a little bit easier to wrap my mind around. But as a practitioner, I also look at these. Like if I see, oh wow, the ecosystem quality is really bad and the human health is really good, doesn't usually happen, I want to see where that's coming from. So both maybe which process stage it's coming from, but also which impact is contributing to it. You can also add these three up. They're normalized to what are called points. So an LCA point is a person impact in a year. And you can collate these and add them up. That I don't like as much. I like looking at 4 endpoint, but that's personal. So there's a US method called, I don't have it down, I'll remember soon, but there's a US method that only has midpoint categories that the EPA made. All right. So before I give you the list of impact assessment methods, I want to talk a little bit, use climate change as an example to how different substances are normalized to 1 unit of a midpoint impact. So in the case of climate change, the unit is CO2 equivalents. So let's imagine a process. This is actually the biodiesel from rapeseed, where I have some CO2 emissions, some NOx, and some methane. And I can't compare these on a climate change on a one-to-one basis. It's like apples, oranges, or carrots, and bread. And that's because different gases have different abilities to trap heat. And so we need a common basis, and the common basis that's decided on it actually makes sense. And most of the global warming emissions are CO2. So if I want to normalize all of these to one basis, which is CO2, I have to apply weighting factors to these emissions. And based on the last IPCC study, 1 kilogram of methane is equivalent to 34 kilograms of CO2 equivalents. So it's just that, and this is over 100 years, so it's a 100-year impact. For 20 years, it's actually quite a bit more, because methane doesn't last very long in the atmosphere. So for CO2, fossil CO2, 1 kilogram of fossil CO2 is 1 kilogram of CO2 equivalent. And NOx, this is an example where we have a characterization factor of 0. So NOx doesn't cause. N2O, on the other hand, has like 290. Problem with agriculture. Questions about that? Yes.
Okay, but this is for air emissions.
Yes.
If I want acidification,
Yes.
something like
There's a similar, I'm not showing the example, but there's a similar, it's all normalized to 1 unit. Yep. the biodiesel from rapeseed, we have 6 kilograms of CO2, or 0.6 kilograms of CO2 equivalents. But if you really don't think you remember this, but 10 slides back when I showed the inventory, there was actually 0.3 kilograms of fossil CO2. So CO2, there's more to CO2 equivalents or to global warming potential than CO2 because the rapeseed methyl ester also had some methane emissions, which I have a feeling had to do with the methanol production, but I'm not sure. Okay, is that good? Happy? All right. So here's some list of impact assessment methods. So I often use Impact 2002 Plus because I can look at the midpoints, like I showed you, but I also get 4 endpoints: human health, ecosystem quality, global warming potential, and resources. And this should actually say 100, not 500. That's a typo. I'm sorry. But there was actually an email that was, and it's on the forum now for the IPSE people, that there was a mistake on EcoInvent's website for the climate change IPCC impact for wood combustion, I believe it was. And people were all upset, and people said, well, EcoInvent will calculate these impacts for you, but they were like, well, it's really a database just for the inventory, so you shouldn't use it for the impact. You should be using something else, either code it or use SEMAPro, which is a software package. So I just want to say that I should have replied to the forum, and I will. I was on vacation when it came out, but actually SEMAPro also has mistakes. So about a year ago, my colleague Leda and she was using the EcoInvent website. I was using SEMAPro. We were getting different numbers, and we wound up contacting SEMAPro and EcoInvent. Both of them had mistakes. And so what I think you have to do, and I learned this from Leda, is you should use more than one impact assessment method. So if I use Impact 2002 Plus, I also use the IPCC 100-year, so I can check that my results come out similar. They're not going to be exactly the same. So usually what I do, I use Impact 2002 Plus, IPCC, and then I use the cumulative energy demand, and I use that to check my resource depletion from 2002 Plus. And if I see something very different, then I have to start digging in and find a mistake. Because, I mean, these databases, it's gazillions of numbers, and they're always updating, and yeah, there's mistakes, so I don't, okay. So that's why it's really easy to take SEMAPro. You can learn it really quickly, plug in some numbers, come out with a number, and say this is the impact. But the interpretation part of the LCA is so important. Because, right, that's why they pay us the big bucks, right? So you have to be thinking. And
so to take one result and one report, you will need to 2 or 3 methods, and each has a couple of cycles.
yeah, but doing the methods is it's not that hard to do the methods. If you have, either your code set up or if you're using SEMAPro, the inventory is what's hard to do. Because the methods, it's like matrix multiplication, and so it's definitely worth doing a couple methods. All right, stage 4. So in this example, I get, let's say, a climate change impact. So what I can do as a human being is I can interpret the results. So we talked about how, or I mentioned at the beginning, how LCA is good for finding bottlenecks. So here I can see, wow, resource 1, not very good. Maybe I don't want to use that resource, or maybe I want to dig in and find out what part of the cultivation is causing this relatively large impact on climate change. So you can see where in the process your impacts are coming from. I think I already said this. Also, okay, so here, I already think I showed you something like this, but this is climate change for all these different biofuels and the petrol ones. And here I have eco-indicator. This was the 3 endpoints: human health, resources, and ecosystem added together. And so I can look at these and see if there are trade-offs among impacts. So maybe let's look at these. So these are my fossils and I say, oh, wow, this guy really reduced climate change emissions. How did it do on the other impacts? Wow, it looks pretty good. I'll show you with my algae example where you actually see trade-offs. You see a process that's good for climate and one that's not good for some of the other impacts. I would prefer to see this divided up by the 3 because resource depletion and climate change usually go together. Because resource depletion for energy system is most often fossil fuel extraction. So if you're depleting fossil fuels, you're also producing CO2. Yeah, do you have a question, Katie? So the same thing we talked about before. This is a really nice way to plot this. So this is the same data, and here it's plotted. We have the greenhouse gas emissions on the x-axis and that eco-indicator on the y-axis, and they're all in terms of percent of low sulfur petrol. This is our reference, so it's 100 and 100. So if we want something that's better than low sulfur petrol, we want to be here. So this is a nice way to interpret the results. So one criticism, and I swear to God I corrected that typo, but making doesn't have an E. All right. So notice these values are single values. And I actually come from experimentalist background, so this really bothers me because you would present something, right? This isn't exactly 82% or whatever number that's equivalent to. And so this was a study I worked on in 2013. And here the metric isn't climate change, it's energy return on invested. So this is how much energy how much energy do you have in your fuel? I don't know if it's diesel, let's say it's 40 megajoules per kilogram. For how much energy did you invest, did you put in to make that fuel? So that means that over 1 is happiness and below 1 is bad. So we looked at all these studies. This was, for making diesel from algae, and they were really all over the place. No really rhyme or reason. They were all single point values. And then we did it with uncertainty. We had like 8 cases, but basically our worst case and our best case spanned all the values that were recorded. So there's just so much uncertainty on the parameters, and this is especially in the case for a developing technology. So fossil fuels we can quantify pretty well, right? We have existing large-scale production. We have lots of data, if you can get data, which I assume you can. But for something like this, there's no full-scale plants, and even the pilot-scale plants are very stingy with their data sharing because they don't want people to know how grim it is. But that's my theory. But all right, so you want to beware of uncertainty, and more people are starting to present LCA with uncertainty. So this is, and those 2 databases I already mentioned, they don't have LCA. I heard a joke, someone at PSI, Chris Mutel said, well, the US LCI doesn't have uncertainty because Americans, we know everything for sure. So, all right, so this I love. Okay, so this is here per dollar of revenue. This is from Apple's website. So they had kilogram. Sorry, this is such a bad quality slide, but kilogram from 2008 to 2012. Kilograms of CO2 per dollar of revenue. So it looks really good. Wow, they got a lot better, right? Something else. Look at the y-axis. Look at what?
Percentage.
Right. I hate when people do that to y-axes. I see that with experimental results too sometimes. So again, with the interpretation or looking at literature, I mean, there's lots of tricks with LCA. I have some study that whoever makes Hummers put out that Hummers are better than hybrid cars. So, yeah. So you want to develop a critical lens to LCA studies. So if this is a more long-term class on LCA, I have this exercise where I did some graduate students at Cornell. There were 2 studies on algae and they had completely different results. It's just like figuring out what kind of assumptions people make. I'm not saying it's always nefarious. Actually, one of the assumptions, it was funny, they made a unit conversion error. So that's also, you gotta watch out for. All right, so we're almost done. Time's it. Oh, it's 5 to 3, not 4, right? I promised once I'd be done by 3:30, which I will. All right, done. Okay. Oh, we did this too. All right. So the advantages, the full life cycle evaluation, it's quantitative. Although I say that with a caveat, it's quantitative for comparing or for finding out what part of your process is harmful. But I wouldn't say it's quantitative. So for example, human health impacts, the unit that's used are DALYs, disability adjusted life years. So if I do my study on algae and I find out, oh, for this process, it's 0.4 DALYs per hectare of cultivation area, even with my plus or minus, whatever it is, I wouldn't look at it quantitative in that way, that this is exactly the impact it's going to cause. Again, it's good for comparing or finding out where you should process. Sorry. It really, you look at a lot of substances, and I'd say most of the environmental issues that are important. Again, identify potential improvements. And if you incorporate LCA within your design, which I think is what you want to do, you people specifically want to do, you can do a better design. So it's good for that. So you don't just design for good economics, but you also design, hopefully, some good environmental or less environmental impacts. So yeah, it's data intensive. There's lots of uncertainties. There's often like data missing. How do you deal with that? It's not temporal, at least classical LCA. There are ways to do LCA on a more temporal base. This is something that's being developed now. So impact assessment methods are, right now, the impact assessment methods that I listed on this couple slides ago, they're generic for anywhere and everywhere. But if you think of something like water depletion, if you extract water in Switzerland or you extract water where my mom lives in Israel, the impacts are very different. And so there is, it's called Impact World. It's in the beta version right now, but it has more localized impact assessment method. So for water, people think it should really be on the watershed. I don't think it goes to that much detail, but there's studies where people couple GIS and work on these local. Same thing with air pollution, right? Adding more pollution in one place will be different than in another place. And in classical LCA, economics, and even social issues, this is very new, aren't it? But in this group, people couple economics and LCA, which is already great stuff. Because, you know, when I started this, my first study was just LCA, and I think I gave a talk here around 3 years ago, and all of a sudden it kind of dawned on me, like, oh yeah, so what? So you develop something that has really low greenhouse gas emissions, but if it costs $80 a liter to make diesel from algae, nobody wants to do it. So you want to. So any questions on your going to a party and talking about LCA? You all feel prepared? Okay, I'll write my email here. We just submitted a paper, and we used LCA and Techno-economic, and you guys have seen this, some of this, or all of this, I think you too. I think you're the only two. So we looked at LCA and Techno-economic analysis to define target parameters. These have to do with growing algae and also financing parameters that would make it a viable technology. So just some background on algae, for those of you that aren't familiar with this wondrous, and I am being a little sarcastic, but we work with a company called Solana, and they have this system where they grow algae, small amounts, in these little little tubular reactors, and then they inoculate these open ponds. Algae needs sunlight, CO2, and some nitrogen and phosphorus. These are grown on a batch basis for 3 days. In our model, we assume that this is just like it looks. Everything's perfect. We have a lot of land. We have a power plant that has waste CO2. Because to get algae to grow quickly enough for it to be even close to economical, you have to pump CO2 into the ponds. It's not like other terrestrial biomasses where they just passively sequester it. But also the growth cycle is 3 days, not an entire season. So they grow really quickly. So that's why people are excited about algae. They're aerial, growth rate is very high. After the algae is grown, it's harvested and processed into an oil. And also the residual algae in our model in some cases is fed to animals. And the animal feeding has actually been tested. So the idea here was to do LCI and techno-economic modeling based on the same process model. And this was what we call our computational framework. So we had energy and material flow models. We did energy integration because we got some hydrothermal processes. And we had our life cycle and our techno-economic model. We used eco-invent for what we call background processes, things like electricity, replaced fossil fuel, etc. And we did uncertainty analysis with many of the input parameters, not all of them. And then we got indicators with uncertainty ranges, and the indicators that we looked at were the minimum selling price of biocrude, and then these 4 indicators that came out of Impact 2002 plus, climate change, ecosystem, human health, and resource depletion. So, actually, before I ask you what functional unit, I'm going to show you this. So this is our process flow diagram. So we had the cultivation of the algae. We actually had real data. This was pretty exciting from Solana. It was ton scale data. And we have 2 scenarios. So we have, in both cases, this is how we dewatered the algae to about 20% solids. And then we had what we call a fuel-only pathway and a fuel and feed pathway. So in the fuel and feed, in both cases, we get biocrude. In the fuel and feed, we get animal feed. And in the fuel only, so about 1/3 of the algae is oil. So the 2/3, that was protein and carbohydrate, was either fed to animals for fuel and feed, or it underwent catalytic hydrothermal gasification to produce syngas, which was combusted to produce electricity, which powered the process. This part is very, very electricity intensive. The mixing of the ponds and the pumping of the water, and even included water recycling. All right, so we have biocrude, and in our second case, we have biocrude and animal feed. So you didn't see it, right? You guys know, but so what functional unit? So we have 1 feedstock and multiple processes. What do you think? Yeah.
It's Dominic.
Dominic,
Yeah.
what do you think?
Algae.
Right, so that's not what we did, but that's what you might think, that you would do algae. And this is where you need a clever person like Lena Gerber to say, well, the problem is that we didn't do algae because the mixing of the ponds doesn't change when the growth rate of the algae changes. So growth rate of algae winds up being a really important parameter in this model. And it's pretty variable. We had data, but we had a pretty wide range. It's like from 13 to 36 grams per meter squared per day, with the median being 3. But the mixing is the same, and it's really important. And so what we did was we did it per hectare of area. Because, yeah, it seemed more appropriate. So we did it per hectare of cultivation area. Dominic, you look unhappy.
No, but how do you know that it's the same amount?
Well, it's not. That's the thing, that sometimes they grow faster and sometimes they grow slower. So by assuming it's a hectare, you capture that.
The whole plant area, just the cultivation area.
I think it was just the cultivation area. It's like 90% of it. I mean, I know here it doesn't look like it, these are empty, but in our model, it was like 90% of it. So I'm pretty sure we got the cultivation area. Pond area. PBR.
If not, self-add photovoltaics for operating the homes, then you have the same part of the area doing something else, and it makes sense. Also. Correct.
So you think it should be the plant area, not the cultivation area?
The area, which is finally what is important, the amount of sun harvested.
Right, so the area of the cultivation. Yeah, and you
So it's the amount of area that is receiving the sun.
Yeah. Glad you're happy. Well, we didn't have PV on site. So. All right, so again, we had data, which was really nice. First study I had, we had no data, so this was exciting. This is data from, it's already a published paper, but it's not so nice. No, my name's on it. But I just want to show that we worked with the contractors from Solana and really did a detailed job of looking at all the capital costs and the operating costs. And but let's look at some results. So I mentioned that I like looking at these 4 impacts because I could see trade-offs. So we have the 4 impacts: climate, ecosystem, human health, resource. These are in units of LCA points. So instead of kilograms of CO2 equivalents, those are normalized to a person year, in this case in the US. 2002 Plus actually does it for a person year in Europe, but there's a paper we had that allows you to recalculate it for the US. So we thought because the context was the US, we assumed this was in Texas. On the left, you'll see the fuel only, and on the right, you'll see the fuel and feed in each of the plot boxes. So if you look at these 2 on the left, and in LCA, this can be confusing. Beneficial is negative. Negative is beneficial. Positive is bad. All right. So if we look at climate change, the fuel only looks more beneficial, even with all the uncertainty, I would say, than the fuel and feed. If we look at the ecosystem quality, we have the opposite story. The fuel and feed is looking more beneficial than the fuel only. And this is because the fuel only, in the fuel only case, we're substituting fossil energy, fossil liquid fuel, and fossil electricity, because we assume the grid in Texas, which is mostly fossil, not all fossil. So we get, here we're substituting, for the fuel and feed, we're substituting the fossil crude, and then we're substituting an animal feed that's made up of cornmeal and soy meal. This was based on testing of this with chickens and pigs. So by substituting this bad grid electricity, we get better impacts for the fuel only. Now for the ecosystem quality, because we're substituting this agricultural product, we get more beneficial impacts for the ecosystem because we're replacing. So a lot of this is land use. So algae grows on a lot less land, and this is one of the exciting things about algae. I mentioned that Solana was in Hawaii. These are all marine algae. So we're not using fresh water, and we're not using arable land. So you see this. The human health impacts that are not so good have to do with the grid. So if we had the voltaics, life would be good. So I don't know what that says about algae, but algae is very expensive. And then the resources is same story as the climate. Yep.
To some extent, then you are measuring the efficiency of the system more than the efficiency of the
Yeah,
system.
you're right. And that's with this choice of the functional unit, that's what happens. Although you have all the impacts from the system you're studying, but what shows here is what's important is what you're substituting. And I think the flip side of that is it's the electricity that you're using that, yeah, because we did in the study with the 20 bar class that was very messy that I showed before this, we did one case where we looked at renewable electricity and everything like really good. So, yeah, you could say, don't worry about this.
But nice, for example, for this case, for example, to say, okay, what is the less impacting growing algae or reserving the space you have for photovoltaics, for example.
Right. So for yeah, that would be part of that. Yeah. I'm gonna guess photovoltaics. That's just a guess. But I think with economics, although now with oil being so cheap, maybe not. I'll show you an interesting economic. Let me just. So the whole point of this paper, I'll continue a little bit of it. It's a really good point. So much of this study is about the substituted product. So then I said that we're using LCA to look at how much we have to improve. Also, to improve a product, to improve, sorry, a parameter. So I mentioned this growth rate parameter, and the median value of the data we had was 23. These are grams per meter square per day. It's an aerial growth rate. And we tried to look at what happened when we increased this growth rate up to what is theoretically possible, though I doubt this will ever happen, 55, but I don't know, maybe 31, maybe 39. It'll be really hard. The purpose of the study was to see what kind of growth rate do we need to get to. And so we see for ecosystem, when we have fuel only, doesn't do much. When we have fuel and feed, if you just look at each group of these data are an improved growth rate, we get some improvement. Although it's pretty beneficial to start with. For the resources with the fuel and feed, we don't really see something, maybe at 47, I don't know, at 39, maybe 75% of our results were good. And what you're seeing with the different colors is increasing the oil content of the algae. And that didn't matter for the fuel only. I mean, maybe it does matter, but we couldn't model it. What we didn't model here is the quality of the oil for the upgrading process. The quality of oil actually matters, but we didn't have data for that. I'm going to just skip to some economic results because I think it's a little cooler. But, and yeah, almost time to go. So our target here wasn't, so our target with the environmental impacts was 0 points. This is the line in between beneficial and harmful. Our target with economics was DOE's research target, which is $5 per gallon gasoline equivalent. And so both of them don't reach that target really. And when we start improving the productivity for the fuel only, and we also look here at different financing options. So we looked at a public financing with a low, there's actually no taxes. It was just the rate of return. So for the fuel only, it looks like if we have a financial incentive and we get up to 47, again, this is not very likely, maybe it would work. But the exciting result is for the fuel and feed. So what we assumed here with these dark orange values is that instead of selling this algal residue as feed for poultry and swine, we sell it for fish meal, which has a much higher value. And they're doing trials so here is where you see, I don't know, when you get up to this high growth rate of 39, you actually don't even need to sell the oil. So I guess this is maybe a no-brainer in high value, energy doesn't bring in enough money, so you need high added value compounds to make the economics of algae work. What's a little weird here is that we assume two prices for the same commodity. So if this ever became large scale and this was a big commodity, it would have its own price somewhere in between probably soy and corn and fish meal. Because actually the chickens, this is kind of interesting, the eggs from the chickens that eat the algae have higher omega-3 fatty acids. So perhaps they could be marketed at a higher price, but Zinjan legs, animal science professor found, because not all the oil is extracted. The oil extraction costs 75% of it is extracted. All right, so environmental trade-offs for that Pimolni pathway versus fuel versus feed, versus ecosystem. So this again illustrates something I said that LCA was good for comparing scenarios. And then with economics for this study, clearly we need economic incentives for renewables. Fish meal or other value-added products are going to be important to make this viable. And this methodology of looking at, having a target for your indicators and then changing your parameters could be applied to other emerging technologies. We'll just mention some stuff we're working on right now. We're looking at this global LCA framework for algae still, because we just got more funding for algae. So we're using a global assessment model called GCAM that looks, it's a partial equilibrium economic model. And then we've created an LCA wrapper. We take the results from this, and so we combined LCA with this economic model that looks at demand and supply, and it's modeling from 2025 to 2100. We're about to submit the paper. We've used regional, so we do it for multiple regions and 5-year increments. So some of you I can show results. This was really long. That is all I have. So any questions? I'll put my email, put right around it, but please contact me. Always use at least 2 impact assessment methods. Email people, keep one back, be responsive, mistakes. Okay.
So what we have the access to equipment is so accessible that most people and for the others that so the license is not so expensive. So
Yeah, I have my own.
you have to know that I'm so
I'm not,
I'm
but I
sorry to say it. So I think that's something which is important. That there is a huge amount of information here, a very huge amount that is validated by experts, which is sometimes makes in fact the reuse of the data. So from what conventional approach where you would just look in the literature and then pick something, and then another one is going to take some other results from another paper. But at the end, you will have something which is inconsistent.
And they have they include uncertainty analysis, which is good. And again, yeah, there's a lot of data, it's verified. And even if there aren't, mistakes happen, but when we had these problems, it was a year ago, and I would just email the staff, telling back and forth every day, and figure out where the mistake is coming from, so they would change it like has more now. I don't know specifically your country, but maybe it doesn't. I don't know. But I know for the US they did used to, and now they have much more. So, and also if you're from a non-OECD country, you can get your license to SEMA Pro, which is equivalent that. Just remember that. But I would have to look to see what kind of how much data. I know they're trying to expand. It used to be just Switzerland and now it's Europe, and now it's more, but it's worth checking what they have.
And they're working on regionalization. So, because even from the Swiss perspective, when we, for example, have to look at what is the environmental impact of photovoltaic panel, then we have to consider that it has been built or produced in China. So we have to look at what is the impact in China and what is the impact here. And I know that they are going into this direction of regionalization. Problem, of course, is that this means data collection, it's manpower, and from the scientific point of view, less attractivity, because producing as life cycle inventories is not anymore a scientific issue. So it means that it's sometimes to find money to find resources. I'm going to continue.
Raphael is missing all the discussion.
Right. Yeah, so I propose that you